You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 461 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about a private military contractor who's planning to acquire nearly 50 F-18s. The House of Representatives is introducing a bill to try to keep more U.S. forces in Africa. And I have some updates on Afghanistan as we come to the end of the first week of the peace deal, the so-called peace deal. All right, everybody, so share the show. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor there. I write the daily news roundup, and the roundup and the show are both on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it. You can find it on its own podcast feed everywhere people listen to podcasts. It's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, along with the Scott Horton Show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, and several other great podcasts. And last, if you want to donate to the show, you do that at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. The first thing I want to mention today is some okay news, I would say. It seems that Donald Trump is willing to sign an extension of the Section 215. This is the metadata collection program from the Patriot Act, and then I believe renewed into the USA Freedom Act. This is set to expire, sunset on March 15th. And, one thing to point out here is that, this does have a sunset. And while it was far too long, I think it was like 5 years, it is at least something that causes debate to come up every now and then. And that's why, even if we're going to pass something like an AUMF or a declaration of war, having some kind of sunset in there is definitely something that we should advocate for, even, while opposing the rest of the legislation. So Trump has now put out that he's willing to sign an extension of this program. Congress is hoping to just, pass a blanket extension. But Donald Trump says that you have to reform the FISA courts, and I believe what he's going after is to limit the FISA courts' reach to only foreigners, and that they would not be able to grant warrants to spy on American citizens. My guess is that this is something that's going to get some media attention as Trump campaign advisor, and I say that not to make him sound too important, but I think that was his role. Carter Page, and I also believe George Papadopoulos were spied on with FISA warrants, and so that likely means that the rest of the Trump campaign, including Trump himself, was spied on too, as these courts grant, a warrant to surveil the person in question and get all that data, all that metadata on people in question, the time of the phone call, the length of the phone call, the location of the phone call, all that information they're able to collect, not only on, Carter Page or George Papadopoulos, but people 2 jumps away. So, their boss called, Donald Trump or somebody connected to Donald Trump, they get to those 2 leaps very quickly. And then they could, get pretty much all the information from the Trump campaign. Now, one interesting thing to remember here is that Trump's campaign handed all their paperwork and information over to the Mueller probe pretty much as soon as it started. And that's another reason why, this whole Russiagate thing has to be seen as completely bogus. I mean, he opened up the books, and it's not something that's reported about or talked about a lot, but it is an important and, significant thing that happened in this whole Russiagate saga. So I think that's where it's going to catch some media attention. I think it's an okay kind of thing, I guess. Like, at one point, I would much rather the 215 program be shut down completely. But if it's going to continue to exist, gain some FISA court reform, well, that's a little bit better. It does seem like Rand Paul has some role and involvement in this and is pushing it in the Senate. I also saw there was a bill today released by Ro Khanna and comparative bill in the Senate by Ron Wyden that seems to be directed towards like what's going on with Julian Assange, in that it would reform the Espionage Act to not be able to publish or to prosecute the people who publish information, only those who were working with a classified clearance and then gave it to people who didn't have a classified clearance. So, the clear example here is that it kind of rubber stamps the prosecution of Chelsea Manning, who stole a bunch of documents, or as Scott Horton always says, and I really like this, liberated them from the U.S. government and gave them to the U.S. people. First gave them to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who then worked with The Guardian, the New York Times, and other papers to publish and put these out. But it would, prevent the, New York Times, WikiLeaks from ever being prosecuted. So, this is another meh thing. I oppose that, you should be able to prosecute people who expose classified information proving crime, which is what Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Thomas Drake, and so many others did. I did see that the Khanna Wyden bills did have another interesting aspect that, it would be another improvement, to the very flawed Espionage Act legislation. And that is, it would allow the judge and I believe the, defense team to put forward the case that the political need to expose this information was significant or important. And, that's interesting that, this would be allowed to be considered by the judge at least during sentencing. And so I suppose the, judge could give maybe a more minimal sentence, although, unfortunately still the person is still prosecuted and will probably, be sentenced to quite a few years. Chelsea Mann was sentenced to 45. All right, moving on. The House is introducing a bill that will prevent Donald Trump from using any funds to remove any U.S. forces from Africa. Now, this has to be one of the most ridiculous things ever. I have Mike Meharry on the show from the 10th Amendment Center every once in a while, and I really like the work all those guys do over there. But one of the problems that I do have with the Constitution, and, Mike writes a lot about it and says how we could use this for, freedom and everything. Occasionally, while you would assume that the most hawkish branch of government is going to be the executive, because, they have commander in chief and have the most power there, it turns out that Congress, every time Donald Trump tries to end a war, tries to prevent it. So not all the time is the Constitution preferable. And, this is kind of just the kind of irony that you have to laugh at a little bit, because it's truly unbelievable that they would look to do this. I'm sure that this congressman and many others aren't doing this to prevent these resources from being redeployed against Russia and China. That's the other thing to mention here, is that the fact that U.S. troops are leaving Africa isn't necessarily a good thing, because this is just a, pivot from fighting terror wars to, Cold Wars and great power conflicts with Russia and China. So like everything else I've talked about on today's show, it's a little bit of a mixed bag in one sense. If it does keep more resources from being deployed against Russia and China, not to devalue the lives of the African people who suffer because of the U.S. military presence and bombs and troops in Africa, but because war with, Russia or China is just so unbelievably dangerous. Now, I will say, my guess is that even if the U.S. does decide to bring U.S. troops home or redeploy them against Russia and China from Africa, we're going to look to continue the majority of the kinetic operations. I think they'll just ask fewer people and resources to do less, or maybe rely more on air power. So getting back to the point I started when I was making this, that Congress loves war, and it's really disturbing, because the legislators, I think, are supposed to more be the representatives of the people and show restraint on foreign policy. But especially now in the presidency of Donald Trump, where occasionally he has some non-interventionist tendencies, the straight line, establishment foreign policy view of, I hate to say it, maybe like 80 or 90% of Congress. Yeah, I mean, they'll cast a good vote on Yemen and the worst things that they will stand against, but at the same time, they hate Trump so much. And they're, funded, their campaigns are by the weapons makers and the war party and the lobbyists, and they, get their briefings from the, major DC think tanks, that when Trump does try to take some actions, like let's say in Syria or here in Africa, the Congress actually tries to force him to be more hawkish. All right, moving on to Afghanistan, where we've now had a week, well, as of like kind of the release of this show, about a week of the peace deal in effect. And I gotta say, at the end of the first week, it's going worse than I would have thought, unfortunately. It seems like the U.S. played a very dangerous game, or is very incompetent, and gave the Afghan government a different copy of the peace deal as to what they gave the Taliban. Now, it may not have mattered if what copy they gave the Afghan government, as at the end of the day, they weren't signatories. Even if they said no, the U.S. could have went ahead with it anyways. Maybe they figured politically, if the Afghan government got a copy of the peace deal that they knew that apparently they would disagree with, that's why they gave a misleading deal to the Afghanistan government, then he could have came out and said it, and it would have, hurt negotiations with the Taliban or the ability to sign this. But, here's essentially what happened. The U.S. gave the Afghanistan government a copy of the peace agreement that said, I think by May 10th or something, negotiations would be taking place between the Taliban and the Afghan government for the Afghan government to release up to 5,000 prisoners and the Taliban to release up to 1,000 prisoners. Now, the copy of the agreement that was given to the Taliban, and the one that was officially signed in, is the peace agreement, says that this prisoner exchange will happen, like I said, by I think May 10th. And so, that's a very important discrepancy. And now the Taliban feel like, well, the Americans aren't living up to their half of the deal, as the first step that's supposed to happen in here with the prisoners being released. The Afghan government says they're not going to do it. And so the Taliban, saying, well, the peace deal's fallen apart, have resumed attacks against the Afghan government, although apparently all attacks have been very calculated to not involve any foreign forces. So, they didn't sign a peace agreement with the Afghan government. It's pretty explicit that the Taliban are still at war with the Afghan government. The idea was that they were wrapping up the war against the foreign forces in Afghanistan. And this is where the U.S. is falling down on their side of the agreement, as when the Taliban forces were attacking an Afghan government checkpoint in the Helmand province, the U.S. went ahead and bombed it. I believe 5 Afghan government soldiers were killed in the attack, and I'm not sure the number of Taliban casualties. So I think by the letter of the deal, it's pretty clear here that the U.S. is already not living up to it, and it could fall apart very quickly. Now, I'm trying not to be overly pessimistic here, because again, that I think this is the best chance to end the war we've had in a while. But, Pompeo's bragging about having 2 secret annexes, and now calling on the Taliban to end violence when it's, his army, that's Trump's army, but, Pompeo has quite a bit of voice in U.S. foreign policy, that's attacking the Taliban. I think that's what I got on Afghanistan. I'm guessing we'll have more developments over the weekend, and this is going to be a big topic on the story for some time to come, just like the next one, which is Syria. I'm recording the show on March 5th, and today, President of Turkey Recep Erdogan traveled to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Apparently, a ceasefire agreement came out of this deal. I haven't read anything that's an official announcement, so I guess I kind of classified all as rumors up to this point, and I'm sure on Monday's show I will be talking about some of the deals of the ceasefire. But I think this is hopefully a step in the right direction. If they agreed to something, it shows that the relationship between Putin and Erdogan hadn't deteriorated that much. It's not something I talked about on the show, but it is something that's been reported a little bit, that there's been shouting matches on the phone, and that the two leaders who previously were signing arms control and deals in spite of the United States, Turkey's NATO ally, dissolved into shouting matches between the two leaders. And so they were able to get this ceasefire deal signed and done. Then, maybe there's a way to de-escalate in the Idlib province, and hopefully this deal comes with getting Turkish soldiers out of Syria, because I think that's the best way to move forward here. U.S. envoy to Syria, James Jeffrey, I talked about on the show quite a bit. He often makes hawkish statements on the situation in Syria. Definitely represents the more hawkish voices in the administration. He says that the reason there's hesitation for the U.S. to give more support to Turkey is because they bought the S-400 missile system for Russia. So there is this really interesting and, almost humorously ironic situation in Turkey where over the past couple of years, Turkey, I think, has in large part been generally displeased with the U.S. policy in Syria. It's not aggressive enough against Assad and backing the group in the region that Turkey sees most violent, concerning, the Al-Qaeda to Americans, and that is the Syrian and Kurdish armed group. Now, I don't think that's necessarily an accurate comparison, but because the Turkish government treats the Syrian and the Turkish Kurds very poorly, those people are in arms resistance against the Turkish government there and do present a problem to Erdogan's authority. So while those are the politics in Syria, there's also this major weapons buy Turkey is looking to make, and the two competing options are the Russian S-400 air defense system and the Patriot missiles that are sold by the U.S. Turkey decided to go with the Russian system. We threatened sanctions and ended up kicking Turkey out of the F-35 program, out of the F-35 production line. But now Turkey is in a situation in Syria where they are in opposition to Russia, trying to continue the Syrian rebellion against Assad in the Idlib province. I don't know, maybe annex portion of that for Turkey. I'm not sure what Erdogan's end goal is here, but it seems likely that Russia would prevent these S-400 air defense systems to be deployed against and over the Idlib province against either Syrian planes or Russian planes. But since they've now bought those systems, the U.S. doesn't kind of ship Turkey a bunch of Patriot missile systems. So Erdogan's put himself in a real problem, and it's a shame that it has to be kind of that absurd irony that actually prevents a weapons sale or a more aggressive foreign policy from being put forward. But in this case, it may just work out. And when I say work out, I mean the U.S. doesn't give armed support to Turkey and end up in some kind of shooting conflict with the Syrian government and potentially even Russia. All right, the last thing I have on today's show is the Israeli elections. We have more votes coming in, and it looks like the current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu may not have enough coalition seats in the Israeli Knesset to make him prime minister. This could mean any number of political scenarios in Israel, but it doesn't look promising for Netanyahu to, be able to form a government coming up. It's also noteworthy that it seems that the Arab parties, which are, the Palestinians in Israel that have the right to vote, about 20% of the population, even though, let's remember that this is a democracy and a democratic election, but while only 20% of the people allowed to vote are Palestinian, if you look at all the territory that's under the control of the Israeli military, or let's say Gaza, where it's essentially Israeli territory and they just have a whole bunch of Palestinians in detention there, only the Palestinians make up about 50% of the population. And so, kind of hard to, say this was a democratic election when such a large percentage of the population wasn't even allowed to vote. But, those Arab parties did manage to take 15 seats in the Knesset, and I believe that's a record for them. All right, that's the show for the week. I know this was a little bit on the shorter side today, but, a lot of the coverage right now is on politics and Super Tuesday and everything. And I'll talk about a little bit on the show, but that's really not what I'm about here at Foreign Policy Focus. I try to talk about the subjects that I am most up to date and knowledgeable on, and not things in my periphery a little bit. But when they come into contact with foreign policy like the coronavirus spreading to Iran, I do think it's important to talk about a little bit. But that, is to say I'm not a doctor and I don't know a whole lot about the coronavirus. I just try to. All right, so share the show. Find it at the Libertarian Institute. Donate to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Follow my work at KYAAALE on Twitter. Chat with me in the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus.